Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's having a good day today. Welcome to this online presentation for the 2021 Student Conference. As you may be able to see by the title, this presentation is titled Pioneering the Modern American Woman, and the goal of this presentation is to examine the early efforts of the Roaring Twenties flapper culture. So, the objectives of this presentation. The first is to demonstrate a working definition of what flapper culture is, as described by historians who are experts on the topic, as well as by primary sources from the 1920s and 1930s, when this culture was all the rage. The next objective is to examine the background of Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of former President Theodore Roosevelt, and her popularity during the early 20th century, which may lead to a pioneering effort of flapper culture. And then finally, this presentation will examine the actions and behaviors of Alice Roosevelt and the connection that they have to flapper culture, indicating an intermediary position between the New Age Gibson girl and the flapper culture of the Roaring Twenties. So to start off, I want to give a little bit of background on Alice Roosevelt. She was born in 1884 and she passed away in 1980. She was the daughter of former President Theodore Roosevelt and his first wife, Alice Lee Roosevelt. Unfortunately, Alice's mother had died shortly after her birth, prompting her father to send her to live with her aunt, because in a state of coping, Theodore Roosevelt had gone and done cattle ranching in the Dakota Territory, in order to help cope with the loss of both his mother and his wife, on the same day within hours apart of each other. And as such, Alice didn't necessarily have the greatest start to her life regarding that. Once her father eventually got over his depression that was spun off from this, and eventually remarried, Alice returned to live with her father as well as her stepmother, whom she endearingly calls her mother throughout her reminiscings of the time. Alice was a very rebellious child, and very tomboyish even, going so far as to being the only girl in an all-boys club in New York. And this extended not only throughout her adolescence, but as well as her teenage years, and even some of her young adult life. When her father became president in 1901 following the assassination of William McKinley, Alice was only 17 years old when she was thrusted into this media limelight, which is very important to note. Next, we must look at the Gibson Girls. The Gibson Girls were this feminine ideal at the turn of the 20th century. They were the brainchild of an American illustrator named Charles Dana Gibson, and he drew these individual women through a series of illustrations depicting them. You can see this on the left, a depiction called Daughter of the South by Charles Dana Gibson. The Gibson Girls are usually argued as the predecessors of flapper culture, as you could see similar actions in them, particularly casually smoking in public, as well as sporting activities such as golfing and horseback riding, and the like, that would go on to be seen in flapper culture as well. Next to the portrait of Daughter of the South is an image of Alice Roosevelt during her tenure in the White House with her father, during her father's presidency. And as you can note, the hairstyle is very similar. They both have very upswept hair. And while it's rather hard to indicate, since it's only a portrait image of that Gibson had drawn, it appears like a very modest dress that this individual is wearing, which the same could be said for Alice in her choice of apparel as well, indicating that this reach that Charles Dana Gibson had with these illustrations was rather wide. The next area of analysis is flapper women as told by historians, where we will come up with the definition. And the image is of actually Zelda Fitzgerald, who is one of the most renowned examples of flapper women during the time. These women who were flappers were significantly more rebellious than the previous generations, and they had certain characteristics that they exhibited. One such characteristic we had previously mentioned was the public smoking, and that also came with public consumption of alcohol as well, more freely and casually consuming these products. They also went out unchaperoned rather often, and there were occasions where they drove their own vehicles, as opposed to being driven by a man. They partook in more man-centric activities such as sporting events like golfing, horseback riding, and the like that we had also previously mentioned. And they were more sexually liberated than women of the previous generations. Affairs were not necessarily uncommon, and by promiscuous also, kissing was another very good example of how they were more liberated, as kissing was rather taboo unless you were a married couple. Some of the primary sources that I'm going to be looking at for this presentation that help solidify this definition of flapper culture include collected writings of Zelda Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, This Side of Paradise, and Flappers and Philosophers, all by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And the reason I've chosen these two individuals is because not only did they live through this time period, but they also did their due diligence in documenting what was typical of women of this era. So I think it's very important to look at what they have to say. That way you can demonstrate the definition beyond what the historians themselves have written. So this is a preview of the points of comparisons that we are going to be looking at, and these are points that both Alice exhibits throughout her life, as well as flappers would exhibit during the rage of the Roaring Twenties. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is a very short list to meet the time parameters. But some of these examples include smoking, alcohol consumption, sports and recreation, driving and unchaperoned movement, and affairs and promiscuity, all of which will be delved in deeper currently. So first, we're going to look at smoking, and as you can see, I have split it down the middle, that way we can look side by side, a side-by-side comparison. So not only are we going to look at recollections and excerpts from The Great Gatsby, or Flappers and Philosophers, or This Side of Paradise, or from Zelda's writings, but for smoking in particular, we're going to actually look at images as well. So throughout The Great Gatsby, Daisy as well as Jordan have been known to smoke cigarettes throughout it, having characters light up their cigarettes throughout the book. And another an example of this on Alice's part, ironically, comes from recollections that she had with an interviewer, where she recollects how she would used to smoke on the White House roof, as she got into a fight with her father about it, and he had said no daughter of his would smoke under his roof. She would proceed to climb onto the roof of the White House and smoke cigarettes just to spite him. Likewise, we have two images here. The first is an image by Russell Patterson entitled Where There's Smoke, There's Fire, demonstrating a flapper with a lit cigarette in a Quilazere, which was a typical way to smoke a cigarette at the time. It was a more stylish way to do it. Likewise, on the right, we see an advertisement for Lucky Strike cigarettes that actually has a testimonial from Alice Roosevelt Longworth titled They're a Light Smoke, Kind to the Throat, where she basically vouches for this cigarette brand, saying how she smokes them and she knows plenty of senators who also smoke them, in order to get the individual to purchase from this brand. Next is alcohol consumption, and throughout The Great Gatsby there are various characters that are drinking a bunch of different alcohol, including Jordan Baker and Daisy Buchanan, who both also partake in alcoholic consumption, and particularly they are geared towards whiskey and cocktails, as Gatsby has had countless cocktail parties. On Alice's side, one recollection she has particularly was when she was agitated during her debutante dance, because they served New York cider as opposed to champagne, and she recollects this saying, "No alcohol was served either. Much to my chagrin, I pleaded for just a little champagne because it was the fashionable drink." Despite her pleads, that did not happen, indicating that she was interested in and particularly fond of it. And she furthers her recollections by recalling that the only time she had gotten rather drunk was when she was part of her father's embassy to East Asia, in which case she got rather drunk in China because they kept giving her more alcohol. Next is driving and unchaperoned movement in general, and there are two sections for each in this one. In the flapper section, particularly in The Great Gatsby, there are many instances where both Jordan and Daisy are the individuals driving the vehicle, And to parallel this, in Alice's instance, she was actually really well known to drive automobiles, and she remembers how scandalous doing so was to her public image, stating that driving a car and smoking in public were bad enough in her father's eyes. In the story, in the collection of stories, Flappers and Philosophers, one of the individuals, Bernice, recounts a dinner dance that she had at a country club, and throughout that section, there were no mentions of any chaperones, just the teenagers partaking in the dinner dance. Alice herself was actually known to travel around without maids or chaperones on certain occasions, and even hail cabs on her own, which was also rather scandalous at the time. Regarding sports and recreation, the best example of this, at least in The Great Gatsby, is regarding Jordan. As when Jordan Baker is introduced to the reader, they establish the fact that she's actually competing in a golf tournament, which she proceeds to go on and lose, making her bitter in Chapter 3 about it. Regarding Alice, she actually was gifted a pocket pistol and was actually known for her marksmanship with it, and other forms of firearms as well. As a headline from the New York Sun read, Miss Roosevelt hits bullseye, tries her hand at a rifle range in Coney Island. Both of these, golfing and marksmanship, there were very male-dominated sports or recreational activities. So both Jordan and Alice partaking in it are very indicative of this shift that flapper culture led to. The last section we're going to look at is affairs and promiscuity. And for flapper culture, particularly in The Great Gatsby, it's implied that Daisy had an affair with Gatsby at one point in time. And Alice herself was actually well known for an affair with Idaho Senator William Borah, to the point where it had been postulated that Borah was likely the father of her only daughter, Paulina, as it has been speculated that Nick himself, her husband, was actually infertile. In Flappers and Philosophers, in a different story, in Flappers and Philosophers, one of the characters, Marcia, implies that she's actually kissed many people over the course of her life, after another important character in that story, Horace, begins to interrogate her over her forwardness to kiss him as she keeps trying to push the topic. And almost similarly, Alice had actually written in her diary regarding a moment she shared with her future husband, Nick. She wrote, "And Nick, when he was kissing and feeling me, did an evil thing, but it was my fault. I have let him do so much, but it was terrible. We are actually engaged, though of course we have been for some time, practically so, and I love him more than anything else in the world." Most notably, this seems rather similar to another facet of flapper culture, which was colloquially known as petting parties, where teenagers and young adults would kiss each other, hug each other. Of course, the implication in her diary suggests something more, though that is up for speculation. In conclusion, Alice demonstrates characteristics of Charles Dana Gibson's New Age Gibson girl, which was the feminine ideal at the beginning of the century. But she also demonstrates facets that would be echoed by flapper culture less than a decade after she had been in the limelight under her father's presidency. As such, it is likely that Alice herself acted as an intermediary that led from the Gibson girl culture to flapper culture, because the Gibson transition from Gibson girl to flapper was not a one-to-one transition. There were facets of the cultures that didn't exist in each other, potentially leading to Alice being this intermediary figure, and one of the pioneering women of flapper culture. On that note, I want to thank you for coming and watching my presentation on pioneering the modern American woman. I hope you all have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. Stay safe and healthy, and good luck on your final exams and final projects, everyone.